So for those of you who watch online, hello. It's very nice having you here this afternoon. It's very sunny in Siena. I know some of you are from different countries, some of you are from different parts of Italy, and we're very happy to have all of you. So it's mostly the world coming inside our university building today. So thank you for having me. And I would like to enlighten you a little bit this afternoon on what I call the Platform Society, which was the title of the book, and I will give you a glimpse of what I now have come to call platformization. And it's particularly this European perspective that I want you to become more familiar with. Now let us start with a few glimpses. Just watch this picture. What you see, just imagine yourself walking on public roads, and those roads normally give you access to shops in a downtown area. Could be anywhere in the world. Could be here, Il Campo, could be anywhere in the world. But you can only enter these shops if their owners pay a fee, a fixed fee, to the two toll chargers. Now on the internet, this is exactly what happens. You know, if you enter your mobile, through your mobile phone, if you enter the internet, you have to download apps. You have to pay a fixed fee to the Google Play Store or to the Apple App Store, right? So you have in fact two toll chargers who prohibit you from coming into that public area unless you pay a fixed fee. And that fee may be up to 20 to 30% for a shop owner to sell their goods on the internet. Now imagine this one. This is, sorry, I have two buttons to push each time, so I may forget that every once in a while. Now look at this square. Figure yourself you enter a village square where you see two signs. This one sign is a Facebook sign. It says, participating in discussion on this square is only permitted after you have signed in. Or another sign that says, your neighborhood prevention watch is facilitated by a private company. This is a public square. Now translate that to the internet. On the internet, Facebook and WhatsApp and Instagram are the major gatekeepers to all of our online communication. You don't pay an entrance fee like you actually pay with the Play Store or the Google App Store, but you pay with your data, right? You enter this agreement with this company, you pay with your data as soon as you enter the square, the public square, which is here an offline variant of the online variant that when you're into Facebook. Another example of a public space. This is a school. It's a primary school in the Netherlands. And when you see the school, you're walking through your neighborhood and you see this school which shows a sign, this public school is supported by Google. Well, this is not imaginary, because just last year, Google serviced almost 70% of all its primary public schools in the Netherlands, providing, for instance, Chrome laptops that are loaded with Google software, that are loaded with Google Apps for Education, and so on and so forth. I will return to this example later on in the lecture. But for now, think about this as two trends. I've just illustrated to you two very pervasive trends. One is that public spaces are turned into private environments. And the other one is that public values are controlled by proprietary infrastructures that are owned by companies. You know, they're not public anymore, they're owned by companies, and those public values are controlled by them. Now for this afternoon, over the next 40 minutes or so, I'm going to talk to you, from these examples, I'm going to talk to you about this lead question. How can we govern public values and public spaces in digital platform societies, particularly in Europe? And I will illustrate all of these, parts of these questions. How do we do that in Europe? Because that is a specific situation that we're into. I'm not going to dwell specifically on Italy, but I will, talk more generally about Europe and what that means for our European online activities. And this will be the outline of my lecture. Some of you may know more of these terms than others because you have read, as a backdrop, some literature that was assigned to you. Others have not, but I will try to do my best to cater to each of your levels of curiosity and knowledge. So first I will talk a little bit about what I mean by platform ecosystems. What are platform ecosystems? Next I will talk about a verb, or a noun, platformization. How do we understand the process of turning something into platformized activity online? I will come back to my example about education that I just touched upon, in terms of public spaces and privatized online activity. Then we get to the more abstract level. And, we will talk a little bit about who are responsible actors in operating these systems, in operating these ecosystems. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about the challenges for Europe. What, as European citizens, as European governments, what can we do to handle, to sort of govern this whole system and turn it more into what we call a European public space? Now, something I forgot to tell you is that I have taken off my face mask, which I'm not allowed to do because you're all here in this room with your face masks on, but I have to because of the recording. This lecture will be recorded and then be released on YouTube. So if you don't mind, I keep my distance from you, but and we have the door open, so we comply with all the rules, but this is special permission for the recording. For those of you who are interested and who would like to get a few more references, here are some references that you may be interested in after listening to the lecture. The first one is the book that Tiziano just introduced. It's from 3 years ago, 4 years ago already, and it's now translated into Italian. So I think you have read the Italian version in class. The second one is an article from New Media and Society that you can look up, that is very easily available. It's open access, and it talks about that process of platformization. When I get to that example, I will point it out to you. And finally, there's an article on particularly education. For those of you who are interested in pursuing that example of platformization, I refer to that particular article in Learning Media and Technology. By the way, if you're interested, we have the slides available for you, and Tiziano may be able to distribute them. So you will get them in a PDF form. So if you're running way behind with making your notes, don't worry, you will get the slides after the lecture. Let's start with the first point, the platform ecosystem. Now, our global online world, the world that we all have come to live in, that we take for granted many days per year, half our time we spend on our mobile phones, the other half probably on the internet through our laptops or other devices. But that global online world is driven by platforms and fueled by data. Data flows are actually the fuel. You think it's still oil, but in fact it's data that, that fuel our platform society. And those platforms and data flows they can be steered by two entities. They can either be steered by companies or they can be steered by states. That is, the way it is now. And in this global online world, there are two ecosystems that currently dominate it, the American and the Chinese. So that is what our world looks like. More recently, it has come to change a little bit, but we may come to talk about that later. We first start with China. China, I touch very briefly on China, but then we go to the American system. China has its own ecosystem, and it's controlled by the state, but it's actually, in practice, it's operated by three main companies. And you see them listed here. It's Baidu, Alibaba, some of you may know Alibaba. It's sort of the Chinese Amazon, the big shopping platform. And Tencent operates WeChat. You may also know WeChat as the Chinese alternative for Facebook. We call those three big companies the bad companies. That's the acronym we use for that. There are a couple more big companies, but I won't throw them into the equation. There's probably one more emerging companies that you have heard of, and that is the company in China that owns TikTok. Who knows the company that owns TikTok? I see you all nodding, but do you know the parent company which owns TikTok? No. You know, that's a huge company. It's growing like hell, and I think within a few years it will be bigger than Facebook. It's ByteDance. ByteDance is the company that owns TikTok. Now, in this acronym, these three companies, Alibaba and Tencent particularly, are becoming extremely powerful. And they're branching out their core businesses. They started like Facebook, like, you know, as an online platform, an online network, social network, or as a shopping network. But now they're sort of branching out into a lot of businesses, into pretty much every sector of society, from online shopping to mobility, from finance to education. In terms of finance, you may know Alipay, which is sort of the pay system, the Apple Pay, but then for Alibaba. Now, these platforms are pretty much gatekeepers to the entire Chinese economy. And they're increasingly wielding power over brick and mortar companies. You know, brick and mortar shops like pharmacies, like grocery stores, etc., etc. So they're becoming more powerful than all these offline companies that provide our service, have provided our services in the past. And they're more and more becoming integrated through those pay systems, through communication channels, and through, you know, various of these other infrastructural platforms. I will show to you in a minute what that looks like. In China, the Chinese government has very strict control power over these companies, and particularly over the way in which these companies steer the data flows of their customers. Ultimately, the Chinese government, controls access to all private citizens' data. And recently, very recently, just last year, the Chinese government started also become very aware of the power of these companies, and they have mandated breakup of companies like Alibaba. They want to split Alibaba, for instance, into 7 different companies. And this is only the wet dream that the American system is dreaming about. You know, they want to break up companies, but it's a very hard thing to do in America. But in China, the state controls these processes, and of course they can mandate that by law. Now, this is as far as China is concerned. I could talk for hours about the Chinese system. I won't do that today. I'm going to concentrate on the American ecosystem. And America, of course, has the ecosystem that you're all very familiar with. It's dominated by the big 5, Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and Microsoft. Meta and Google, of course, you know, Facebook and Google have gotten different names for their parent companies. But that dominates pretty much the rest of the world. Europe, America, Africa, and Asia, except for China, of course. Even Russia. We may talk about that later, but in Russia, the Western system was also very dominant. And the American tech companies, they have tried to enter the Chinese ecosystem, you know, quite a number of times, but they weren't very successful. They were either barred by the Chinese government, or they were censored, like Google search, for instance, was censored, or they were forced to align with Chinese companies, and they didn't want to do that. In fact, Google search as a platform, it withdrew from China after, you know, the Chinese government censored its search engine. And Facebook stopped all its activities in China. But I think that was also because of this huge competition, fierce competition with WeChat, that obviously Facebook would lose, mostly a language thing. Now, before you think that every American company has withdrawn from China, that's not true. Apple is still very active in China, and almost 40% of its App Store revenue, Apple's App Store revenue, comes from China. So it's still very much a big presence in China. Now, vice versa, the other way around, the US is trying to bar Chinese companies to enter the American market. And we have seen that most recently with the emergence of TikTok. the Americans are not very happy with TikTok. Facebook is certainly not very happy with the emergence of TikTok, particularly since it's growing very fast, very rapidly, and is taking over Facebook, almost taking over Facebook's position in some parts of the world as the most powerful social network. So that will be a very interesting battle between the two powerful forces. And in fact, once you start thinking about it, this battle has become almost a geopolitical dance, a geopolitical contest of, forces. We used to think of geopolitics in terms of big states, fighting each other, which is of course still happening. But geopolitical contests are increasingly happening online, on the technological fields, right? Now, let's compare just the two systems. They appear to be very different. At first sight, you think, okay, there's the American system where data are owned and exploited by the big five corporations, and that creates a huge potential for corporate surveillance, of course. That is what the system and how it works on the American side. That is underpinned, that system, by an ideology of what we call libertarian capitalism. It's also called surveillance capitalism, particularly by Shoshana Zuboff, who wrote a book on that. You may have heard about it, but that is the kind of ideology that underpins that ecosystem and how it works. On the other hand, you have the Chinese system, so this is the typical difference. Data are owned by the state, even if they are mediated by these corporations, but still the state controls that system and the data flows. Citizens and corporations are subject to state surveillance, mediated by companies. That's sort of a dual system. And then, of course, it's underpinned by the ideology of state capitalism. Okay? So these are vis-a-vis the two systems that control basically the two ecosystems in this world. And although these systems look and are, very almost extremely ideologically different, they're also very much alike in a number of ways. I won't dwell on that, but they're in fact, they may have even more commonalities than they have differences. And they're actually intertwined on the business, from the business perspective. They're intertwined at various levels. For instance, Chinese platform companies own stakes or stakeholders in American companies, and vice versa. So in many ways, these systems are interconnected and they couldn't be pulled very much apart. I could give another lecture on that for an hour, but I won't. So for now, we are going to concentrate on the American system. So I've already pointed out to you the big five companies, Apple, Amazon, Alphabet, Google, Microsoft, and Facebook. And you may not know this, but in terms of market value, when we're just talking economics, the market value of these big five companies, they would, if you just put them together, if you pull them together, you would have the fifth largest economy in the world. After the US, after China, Germany, and Japan, this would be the fifth largest economy. That is tremendous. I mean, this has never happened in history before. Another first is that Apple company last year reached it hit a mark of $1 trillion of market value. That never ever happened to any company in history before. So these are incredible numbers. Out of the 10 most powerful companies in the world, only 10 years ago, only one of them was a tech company. Now 7 out of 10 are tech companies, pretty much the companies that I just listed. So out of the 10 most powerful market valued companies in the world, 7 are tech companies. That means that it totally changes our perspective on how powerful platforms are in our world, right? It used to be Shell Oil and companies like very much, energy companies, market companies, anything but tech companies. And now they're almost all, tech companies. But I'm not going to talk much about their market value. What I would like to talk about is their incredible societal power and political influence. Increasingly, we realize how powerful these companies are in terms of their impact on our democratic values, our public spaces and the way that we, all of us are leading our lives in open democratic societies like the ones in Europe. So that is what I will mostly talk about today. And if we just saw how these two ecosystems, the American and the Chinese, are pretty much dominating the entire online world, but squeezed between that is Europe. And Europe feels increasingly squeezed between the US and China, if not for just one reason, and that is that it doesn't have an ecosystem by itself. It's dependent on the ecosystem, mostly of the American system, increasingly on the Chinese system, but it doesn't have its own independence carried by a European ecosystem. Now, some of you may tell me, but there are some European tech companies. True, I completely admit, there are some European tech companies that are quite big. Estonia, for instance, started Skype. However, Skype was bought up almost 8 years ago by Microsoft. So on the other hand, Spotify, you probably come up with Spotify. It was started in Sweden. Sure, but currently Spotify is owned, I think, 40% by American and Chinese stakeholders. So is it still a European company? And it's a single company. As a Dutch person myself, I'm very proud to mention two unicorns that come from the Netherlands. One you may have heard of, Adyen, is a pay service that has become very big. And ASML, which is a huge wafer machine building company in the south of Holland. It's one of the biggest. We're almost, for half our wafers, our computers, the machines that make computers actually, we're dependent on that company. Very few of you know, but that's because these are not entire ecosystems. They're single companies that have a presence in Europe, but they're not very powerful in terms of what I'm going to explain to you in terms of carrying our democratic systems. So European countries, in terms of their online services and online infrastructures, have become almost entirely dependent on the ecosystems that are built by these foreign powers, right? China and America, particularly America. And this, in fact, has become a political liability, as Europe is now caught between those two superpowers fighting over technological control. And they're continuously causing geopolitical tensions. We may talk about that a little later, but what I want to bring up in terms of these geopolitical tensions is the question of democratic control, public values and public space. I talked a little bit about public space and showed to you how important it is, having a market square that is open and accessible for all people. Public values, what kind of public values are relevant to Europe that may not be, maybe differently valued in other parts of the world? Well, you know most of them, but you may have never given that much thought in terms of how important it is to our culture. Values like security. You don't want your data to be hacked or stolen. You want it to be secure. Values like privacy. We have known, particularly in Europe, we very much value our privacy, the privacy of our data and the privacy of our private information. We very much value transparency and accuracy. For instance, in terms of the news that we consume, almost half, 50% of news online is consumed through Facebook. Over the past 5 years, I think we've become incredibly aware of the value of accuracy, how important it is to consume correct news and news that isn't misinformation or fake news. On the other hand, we have a number of public values that pertain to society as a whole. We want our online world to be fair. We want it to be inclusive. We don't want it to be discriminated against. Remember last Friday we were on the square and we saw a lot of algorithms already carried those discriminatory values. So you have to be very aware of non-discrimination in terms of public values. We want to have accountability. We want to be accountable for what happens in an online world. That's part of our legal requirement and legal system. We want democratic control, but how do we control a system that is proprietary, that we don't have, that we can't recognize as part of a public space? And of course, we value sustainability, which is it's very relevant right now when the online machinery, the online ecosystem is absorbing more and more data and more energy and power. So all these values are very, very important to our democratic systems. But they often sit in tension with the commercial values that, for instance, we see in the American system. A commercial value like convenience. We want our apps and our mobile phones to be convenient. We want them to serve us. But that often sits in tension with the value of privacy. We don't want to give away all our data in order to make those systems become seamlessly connected. The thing with public values that you need to remember, you don't have to remember all these values, but you need to remember that they're not fixed. They're not fixed. It's not something that you can go to a store and buy them off the shelves. Please give me an ounce of autonomy or give me an ounce of transparency. That's not how it works. Public values work as part of a democratic society. They're negotiated. We negotiate public values constantly. For instance, algorithms that enable personalized learning in a classroom may be clashing with student privacy or teachers' professional autonomy. And that is something that we constantly weigh when we enter the online world. And we want to have control over what value takes over another value. Okay, what exactly is platformization? And I already told you it's sort of a verb and a noun. It's not platforms that do something, it's a process that enacts us, that facilitates us to become part of that platform world. Now, what is platformization and how do platforms exercise power? How do they impact democratic societies in Europe? And in order to explain that, I have come up some years ago with the metaphor of a tree. It's a simple metaphor, but it works to explain a hierarchy in the ecosystem. And particularly, it explains how power in the online world is distributed and accumulated. Now, those of you who think, well, platforms, they're all the same, they're all like a bunch of platforms. Well, I have to warn you, not all platforms are equal. Some are more equal than others. Right? So if that rings a bell, it's exactly what I'm saying. Some platforms are more important than others. And that's what I'm trying to explain in terms of the tree, the platformization tree. If you would split the tree into three parts, a tree into three, you can sort of recognize the lowest level, which is the roots of the tree. And that is what I call the digital infrastructures, right? That is, I'm going to explain it in just a second. Then the trunk is where the intermediary platforms are formed. And finally, the branches sort of represent the sectoral platforms. I'll be right with you in terms of explaining. Now, first note that I have drawn some lines here, but there is not a precise there's no clear boundary, in fact, between each of these levels. They gradually morph and they obliterate their boundaries between them because it's a process that I call platformization. And you have to remember that the middle of the tree, the trunk, this tall trunk, that is the center of power, okay? Now, I'm going to explain each of these levels to you. And you may not be able to read the small print. Some of you in the back may not be able to read it. That's fine. You both get the slides and you can find this in the article that I refer to. So if we start with the roots, what we're talking about is in fact the material infrastructures. Usually, the stuff that you don't see and you're not interested in, okay? Those of you who work constantly on your mobile phones or your laptops, what you don't care about because you don't see it is a lot of the material infrastructure that is either in orbit, satellites for instance, or down under the ground, cables, cable infrastructure, or far away out of sight from urban areas like data centers, right? So I distinguish several levels here. There's things like cables and satellites, internet exchange point, semiconductors, internet and intranets, The whole World Wide Web is sort of a coded protocol, and a domain name system, which we need for distributing our information packages, which is data. Data centers, I don't know, do you have many data centers that you know where they stand in Italy? Do you know where your data centers are? You have no clue? None of you has ever thought about where are these data stored? Where are they distributed? Interestingly, in my country, we just had a big controversy around the building of a big data center in the middle of the Netherlands. And since then, everybody knows why data centers are so important, because Facebook was going to position a huge data center in the middle of the Netherlands, and it was absorbing almost 20% of our clean energy. And since then, a controversy bursted out, and Facebook has now withdrawn from the project. But since then, everybody knows why data centers in the Netherlands are so important. We have very few little space, of course. Housing is extremely expensive, and this would take up pretty much, you know, the energy level of a complete city of Amsterdam in a year. So this was became a total outrage, and since then we know how important material infrastructures are in terms of, you know, the platform society. Last part of that layer is consumer hardware. All of your, you know, part of your infrastructure is the devices that you're now working on. Your laptops, your mobile phones, you know, that is part of the infrastructure that we rely on, that you usually don't see or you look through it, but it's very important for how your data is delivered and how it is part of that controlling ecosystem. Okay, then most important is the middle layer. And now we move to the trunk. As I said, this is the center of power in terms of the infrastructure. And when I talk about the trunk, I talk about cloud services for data storage, analytics. If we move up the trunk, we find identification services or login services, your Facebook ID, your Apple ID. Further up, we find advertising services. Facebook and Google pretty much own that system online. We look into search engines, Google Search. Google Search is almost 92% of the market in Europe is covered by Google Search. 7% is owned by Bing, that is pretty much 99%, and then we have 1% owned by other. So it's very much a concentration of power in that trunk. We have app stores. I just explained to you at the beginning, Apple and Google pretty much divide that market, Play Store and Google App Store and Apple App Store. And we have social networks, Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, YouTube, a number of others. So, and of course, retail networks, Amazon Shopping, Amazon Marketplace and Google Shopping are, you know, very big players in that field. So this trunk is pretty much a bottleneck for all the data flows that are have been flowing around. So most of these services in the trunk are operated by 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 of the big players, usually 1 or 2. They're pretty much you know, a monopoly or an oligopoly, so as they call it. Finally, the branches. And here there are sectoral platforms in the branches of the tree. They commonly serve a particular sector. In the book that you've read, we covered 4 specific sectors. News, covered education, healthcare, and mobility. But there are a number of other sectors that, you know, are now served by these platforms. And interestingly, increasingly as, you know, the ecosystem is growing, the branches are also penetrated by the big 5 American companies, and each of the branches is becoming sort of a playing field for some 1 or 2 or 3 of the big 5 companies. I will give an example later in terms of education. Now, what this all comes down to is platformization power, the power of platforms to penetrate every single part of our daily lives that we carry out online. Right? From the very bottom of the infrastructure all the way to the branches in every sector. You know, once you enter a classroom, whether you enter a classroom or go do grocery shopping, you're constantly intermediated, connected through those platforms. Now, Platformization power contains three processes that I wanted to point out to you. Vertical integrations. I'm going to explain that in just a little bit, but data flows at the back end of your screens. You know, the back end means where all the data flows are connected and interconnected. That is where vertical integration takes place. From all the way down in the roots, you know, and the cloud, through the cloud services, through the PACE systems, your ID functions, all the way to the branches, you know, the apps that you use to read the news or to do things on your computer. That is what we call the vertical integration of data flows. Infrastructuralization means that basically these platforms like social networks or search engines have turned into an infrastructure. We used to call infrastructures like water supplies and electricity, but now, you know, without, for instance, you know, Facebook in terms of an infrastructure, without Google search, we would not be able to search whatever on the internet. That has become we also call it a social infrastructure. And finally, the process of data monetization. Behind the interface, data flows are connected and those are monetized. You know, the data are turned into money. That is the business model basically of each of these platforms. They're turning your data, user-generated data, into money flows. How that happens is an intricate process. It's very technical on the one hand. It's also very economic on the other hand. But that is an important process that is part of platformization. Now, very briefly, let me explain to you. Oh, I skipped that slide, right? I talked to you without showing you the slide. I will give you an example from education. Each of the big 5 companies has recently gone into education, big time. I mean, not just a little bit, they spend huge amounts of money on the sector of education. And you will understand shortly why that is so important. Here, Jeff Bezos is going to create schools where the child is the customer. A child's becoming not a citizen, but a customer in this system. Inside Facebook's plan to build a better school, Facebook is building schools. It's organizing systems around their algorithmic learning analytic skills in order to, you know, take over schools. And finally, this case was a very important study that came out, was published in the New York Times on the Googleization of education. Google is taking over the classroom. The New York Times proved that, and they had a very interesting series of articles on that topic. Now, what happens is that big companies, big tech companies like Google, like Apple, like Facebook and Microsoft are each taking charge in a different way of primary schools by providing them those services that allow them for those data flows to be connected in the back end of interfaces. And let me explain you in terms of the tree how that process works. We have researched this very, you know, in a detailed way, so I won't go into that. You can read that in the article. But this is an example, a perfect example of vertical integration. If in the Netherlands, I told you at the beginning, 70% of the primary schools in the Netherlands are now serviced by Google, right? They buy Google Chrome laptops to start with, hardware. They're loaded, they're preloaded, pre-installed, have Google search and analytics. And these laptops are offered as a very cheap incentive. And then they're loaded onto software like Google Apps for Education. And of course, they offer a cheap connection to Google Cloud services. The interesting thing, and this is all offered as one package. The interesting thing is it is very easy to, and quite cheap, to actually enter this vertically integrated service system, but it's very expensive to get away from it or get out of it. So you can move your data as a school, you can move your data into Google, but it's very difficult to take those data out and put it into a different environment. So once you're part of that system, it is very hard, you sort of experience what we call a vendor lock-in or a user lock-in. Once you're locked in, it's very difficult to actually go to a different service, like say to an Apple Cloud services or Microsoft Azure, which is also a cloud service. So in fact, what Google is able to do is through the ID function, the identification function of children, they log in with their Google ID. They're able to connect data flows outside of the school. You know, they watch YouTube, they watch whatever Google platform there is outside of school. They can be connected to their learning processes inside the school. And this is, in fact, what we see happen everywhere. The cross-sectoral interlinking across sectors between shopping and schooling and healthcare and, you know, all different sectors watching the news can get connected at the back end. And that is how you monetize basically data flows and make them personalized services. To return to this example, in the Netherlands we have a few schools, I think there are 10 or 20 schools in Holland, that are now called Google reference schools. And they refer to the very special privileges that Google schools, once they're serviced by Google, they get special attention, they get provided extra services by Google, they become very much the focal points of education, and they try to make them serve as model schools for other schools, right? So they become special models for entire school systems. Now what happens in these schools is that literally public spaces, these are all public schools, they're turned into private environments. And public values are controlled by proprietary private infrastructures, from roots to the branches, across the trunk of the tree, right? So that is what we mean by platformization as a process. Okay, I will go through this very quickly, because that brings up the more abstract questions, right? Who is responsible for guarding our public values, in European platform society? Now, this is sort of a model that, you know, is sort of a basic political economy 101 course, but I wanted to point out to you the three types, the number of different stakeholders that are involved in organizing the platform ecosystem. You have forces from market, from state, and from civil society. Now, from a market perspective, of course, businesses and consumers and entrepreneurs, you know, they control that system. From a state perspective, you have local and national and supranational governments who control the system, you know, and from a civil society perspective, you have citizens who would be eager, you know, we have cooperatives, we have collectives, non-governmental organizations, and in mostly our political systems, what we aim for, what we strive for is to reach a balance between those three types of actors, right? And we call that multi-stakeholder organizations. Now, coming back to those two systems, what we see is that for Europe, both these American and Chinese ecosystems, they're problematic for a few reasons. There is no democratic control. All the infrastructures are proprietary. We cannot control proprietary systems, right? They're not open to democratic debate. If data are proprietary or controlled by the state, who owns those data? It should be, in fact, you know, people like you and me who would be able to control the data that we ourselves generate, but that doesn't happen. We have a lack of open public space in the ecosystem, and very importantly, we have very few civil society actors, you know, civic organizations that control parts of that ecosystem. So these make Europe actually a precarious system within these controlling two big ecosystems. So what can we do about that? I'll just skip these two slides because I think I'm running out of time here. No? Okay. I'll just do this one. Because I think if we would want to grow a European tree, you know, a European platform tree, and we would look at the trunks of the Chinese tree here, the Chinese tree and the American tree, it's very hard to start building a completely new ecosystem from scratch. People have asked me, would you like Europe to, for instance, have its own social network company? Would you like to have its own cloud services? Well, yes and no. I don't think it's feasible that in Europe we would build a system from scratch. I just don't think that is very realistic. But I think we can help to redesign, particularly the American ecosystem, to make it more comfortable with European public values. And I will talk in a minute about how we could do that. But 2 pointers here to start with is that to grow a more Europeanly shaped platform tree, we need to think about redesigning the architecture of that ecosystem. And we can do that by doing at least 2 things. There are more, but 2 things would be, I think, mandatory. To create public alternatives and to impose interoperability by law. I will explain each of those over the next 5 minutes. Creating public alternatives is because we don't have them. We don't have any public clouds in Europe. We don't have any public social networks. We are completely dependent on the privatized systems. Why don't we just, organize or develop some of these public spaces that I indicated in the beginning, a public square? We have public squares. Why not public social networks? And the second one is imposing interoperability. And that is the ability to freely move and switch between services that are operated by different platforms. Right now, once you're like me, you're part of the Apple system, it's very difficult to move out of that system and make it interoperable with another hardware system. And this one is connected to my iPhone, of course, and to my my Google my Apple identity, etc., etc. Same holds for those of you who are into the Google vertically integrated system. Interoperability means that we try to get away from vendor lock-ins and user lock-ins. So, in short, and now I get to come to my conclusion, this is my thesis for today. Europe needs to articulate a set of principles that prioritizes public values and public space to help societal stakeholders create an open, democratic, and diverse platform ecosystem. Diversity is very important here. So that brings me to the last part of my lecture, and that now I get to the more abstract level, but you may not be interested in politics or the legal system, but hey, that's part of how we organize societies, right? So it is something that sketches a future where we have to become more involved with these types of actions. What could we do? What could actually be the main principles of such a European-shaped ecosystem? And here are some proposals. I'm not saying this is the solution, but there's some proposals. I would propose to expand legal frameworks. I would like to restore a balance between those actors that I just sketched, the societal stakeholders. I would like to guarantee data sovereignty, very important term, and promote platform diversity. But I will go into each of these principles. First, I think the EU, the European Union, needs to expand its legal frameworks, and it's actually doing that right now. Since 2015, the European Union has increasingly cracked down on particularly American platform companies, and try to force them to sort of comply with European rules in terms of public values. For instance, the big privacy law that went into effect in 2018, the GDPR, you probably all know that, has had a major effect on how companies across the world are behaving in terms of implementing their privacy policies, right? You may find that, abhorrent that, we need such a gigantic privacy law, but it has worked fine. It's what we call the Brussels effect on platform ecosystems. There are different fines that have been applied to Google that are now being investigated by the EU, for instance, Apple and Amazon, that will probably result in big fines. But you may find this weird, but I'm not very fond of this fine thinking in terms of, cutting damage after the damage has already happened. I would like to see more in terms of prevention and more of adjusting legal frameworks. Legal frameworks like antitrust, like market power abuse, privacy. But the real problem is that you can find whatever you want, but you're not going to change the system as such. And that is exactly what I'm trying to aim at. How can we change the architecture of that ecosystem, right? Now, currently, this is a very important legal framework that is now currently being developed in Brussels. The Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act, DSA and DMA in short. I can explain a lot about that, but I won't, because most of you are not lawyers and are not into law departments. But it is a very important, I think it's a very important means of making companies comply with the mandatory interoperability. That, I think, is going to be taken care of by the DSA and DMA. But what it doesn't do, you know, a legal framework alone is going to be insufficient to counter the fundamental disruptive effects of these platforms. So we should also work on changing the ecosystem's architecture, you know, the very nature of that ecosystem, if we want to really change the European system in terms of its technical and legal principles. Secondly, I think we need to restore balance between the three actors that I just pointed out: market, state, and civil society. And the latter, civil society, is almost completely absent from this picture. Now, several years ago, you may know this name, Tim Berners-Lee. Do you know Tim Berners-Lee? I see some faces nodding, but just to remind you, Tim Berners-Lee was the inventor of the World Wide Web in the 90s, and he has become a very important figurehead of the free and open society, you know, in terms of an online creation of an online world. He wrote a manifesto several years ago because what he is seeing is that increasingly the online world is being taken over by companies, by corporations who just have one single interest, and that is their commercial interest. So last year he designed a contract for the web, and he articulated several core principles. Some of these core principles were meant for governments, some for companies, and others for citizens. Now, if these were implemented, I think the internet would indeed look, you know, very differently. But the thing is, although a few companies have signed this contract, it is very non-committal. You know, there's no fines, there's no sanctions for non-compliance. So it's basically a contract that people sign, but they do not live up to. So that is a problem. Third, and I'm almost done here, I think we need to guarantee data and user sovereignty. Now, what does that mean? Europe, in fact, should redefine data ownership. Who is the owner of your user-generated data? It should be very simple. You are the one who are generating these data. You should be the owner, right? Data belong to citizens who can control their use, and open data belong to communities, right? That should be simple. Another rule that may apply here is data portability. Right now, you can carry data around to different platforms. You cannot do that. You cannot carry around data to different platforms without switching costs. You know, switching costs are the cost that you pay as a citizen to go from one platform to another. To remind you, if you want to take your phone number from one service provider to another, you can do that, right? You can take it from one to another. Many platforms do not allow you to bring, for instance, Facebook does not allow you to take your own data, bring that to TikTok or to, well, whatever other platform that you can think of. So that means that data portability is still, you know, very much prohibited by the systems as they are in place. One of the things the DSA and DMA is trying to change is precisely this: data portability and interoperability. And finally, data transparency. You know, in fact, we should think of data flows as if it were money flows. We're very used to having accountants look into into money flows and how they go, and you have to comply with certain rules as far as money flows are concerned. We could do the same with data flows. We only don't think in terms of, we don't think about data flows in terms of money flows. They're very different and they're unregulated. So these are three principles that we may apply. And finally, we should promote platform diversity. And that is one of the, I think, one of the most important things, because we need to stimulate public and non-profit platforms. Currently, why don't we have public social media networks? We only have Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram, etc. But we have public broadcasting, we have public broadcast systems. Why don't we have a similar sort of public space on the internet in terms of social networks? Why don't we have public cloud services? We don't have those. So a lot of these open public spaces we have not stimulated, and we should definitely stimulate that. Once again, we should require interoperability between platforms, and I already talked about that, but we should also mandate open source software whenever possible. The advantage of open source software is that you can develop open source and you can stimulate that. That it's the kind of innovation that you would like for the public sector, and that is also making the internet more affordable for a lot of public institutions. And finally, we should secure public online infrastructure, which means, for instance, that why don't we have public data centers or public cloud services, or we have public infrastructures like our water supplies, we have public infrastructures like electricity. Why don't we think of infrastructures, online infrastructures, in terms of public property? Right? So that is a way of thinking about infrastructure that you may not be familiar with, but should become more part of our normal thinking. Okay, now this is my conclusion, and it's almost, it's almost like an open door by now, but we need to cement public values and public spaces in the architectural design and governance of platform ecosystems if we want to secure a fair and open digital society. And on that note, I would like to end. I'm actually quite optimistic about the future, but maybe we can discuss that after some questions. Sorry for taking so long. I realized that I've continued for about an hour. Thank you for your concentration. That is quite something behind your face mask. So, and now the floor is yours.